traded for 2 cows by her drunken father. A Lakota chief brought the cows back and kept her. The cows were standing in my horse pasture when I came back from the river. 2 of them, a brindle and a gray one with a torn ear. I stood there in the late morning, still wet from washing, and I looked at those cows a long time. I knew whose they were. I knew the smell of that man's animals before I ever set boot in his yard, sour hay, and not enough water, and the particular laziness of a man who lets things go to ruin and calls it fate. His name was Aldrich, Dutch Aldrich. He ran a claim 2 miles east of the tree line, him and a bottle and whatever was left of a life he'd dragged out here from Missouri. Had a daughter. I'd seen her twice at the trading post, maybe 3 times. Tall, the way women from certain places are tall, not soft tall, but the kind that comes from carrying water and wood and everything else a man ought to carry himself. Dark hair pulled tight, eyes that didn't waste time. I'd never spoken to her. I looked at those cows another minute, and then I went and saddled my horse. My name is Red Hawk. Chente Chihilla, the one the heart holds dear, was the name my mother gave me, but I have been Red Hawk since I was 14 and brought down an osprey with a single throw. I am chief of my band, which is not as grand a thing as white men imagine when they say the word chief. It means the old men trust my judgment. It means the young men watch my hands when there is trouble coming to know whether to hold or move. It means I eat last in lean times and sleep lightest when anything is wrong, and there is almost always something wrong. I have been doing it since I was 23. I am 47 now. That is not a complaint. It is just what it is. I rode east with those 2 cows on a lead rope, and I thought about nothing particular, the color of the sky, whether the creek would flood again before winter, whether the 2 young men I'd sent north had made it to the Yellowstone. I did not think about Dutch Aldrich. I did not let myself think about what kind of man trades a daughter for livestock, because that kind of thinking makes a man hot when he needs to be cool, and I have learned, at some cost, that the hottest moments of my life have also been the ones I most regret. I smelled the Aldrich place before I saw it. That same sour hay smell, and under it the watered-down particular stink of a man who has been drinking since morning. He was on the porch. Well, porch is a generous word. 3 boards over 2 stumps and a lean-to roof that had been leaning since before I'd first ridden past. He was sitting on a feed bucket with a clay jug between his boots, and when he saw me coming he stood up fast, the way guilty men stand, the whole body sudden, overperforming innocence. I stopped at the fence. I let the 2 cows off the lead rope inside his gate. He started talking before I'd said a word. Something about a fair trade, something about a man's right to conduct his business, something about how it wasn't my concern what arrangements he made on his own property. He had the voice of a man who has rehearsed a thing alone and finds it less convincing said out loud. I let him finish. Then I said, "Where is she?" He went sideways, started in again about arrangements and property and a man's rights. I looked at him the way I look at a dog that is barking at a fence it can't get through. I waited until the noise stopped. I said it again, not louder, just again. He pointed at the barn. I did not hurry. Hurrying in front of a man like that gives him something, gives him the idea that he has rattled you, that he has some purchase on your next move. I tied my horse at the fence. I walked to the barn the way I walk across my own ground, which is like a man who is not in a hurry because he does not have to be. The barn door was on a leather hinge and it stuck on the bottom. I lifted and pulled. Inside, 2 empty stalls, some broken harness hanging on a peg, a smell of rot coming from somewhere in the wall. And her. She was sitting on a crate in the middle of the floor with her hands in her lap and no ropes on her, which surprised me a little. Just sitting there, straight-backed in the dim, like she was waiting for a train. She looked at me when I came in. She did not look afraid exactly. She looked like a woman who has already thought through every bad outcome and reached some private conclusion on the other side. I said, "Did he hurt you?" She said he traded me. I'd call that a hurt. I said before, did he hurt you before today? She thought about that. She said, he hit me twice in my life. Both times he was sober enough to know what he was doing and drunk enough not to care. I hit him back both times. He stopped hitting me. I thought, good. She said, are you the man he traded me to? I said, I am the man who is returning the cows. She looked at me a long time. I noticed then that she'd been crying, not recently, but earlier. Her face had that particular tightness around the eyes that goes with it. She was not crying now. She said, then what happens to me? I said, that depends on what you want. She said, I don't want to be here. I said, then you won't be. I don't know exactly what she expected to happen next, but I think whatever she expected, it wasn't what happened, which was that I walked back out of the barn, went past Dutch Aldrich without looking at him, untied my horse, and stood beside it with one hand on the saddle and waited. After a moment she came out of the barn. She had nothing with her except what she was wearing. She walked past her father the same way I had without looking, and she came to where I was standing. I put my hands together for her to step up. She looked at my hands. She looked at me. I don't know what she was deciding. Whatever it was, she decided it, and she stepped up, and I helped her onto the horse, and I mounted behind her, and we rode west. Aldrich said something behind us. I don't remember what it was. Some men's words aren't worth the ear it would take to hold them. Her name was Clara Aldrich, though she told me later that she'd been thinking about shedding that name for years, that it sat on her like something belonging to someone else. She said her mother's name before she married had been Sheridan, and she liked the sound of that better, which I took to mean that she understood what I already knew, which was that a name is something you earn or inherit, and you are allowed to decide which parts of your inheritance you keep. I brought her to our camp, which at that time of year was at the bend of the Elk River, 30-some lodges, maybe 140 people, half of them children, a third of them old women who knew more than any of us but pretended otherwise out of patience with the rest. I brought her to the lodge of Winona, who was my mother's sister, and who has not been surprised by anything in 20 years. I told Winona what had happened. Winona looked at Clara for a long time, the way she looks at things she is measuring. Then she nodded and said something about the state of my saddlery that had nothing to do with anything, which is how Winona says yes. I did not see Clara much in those first days. I had my own work, a dispute between two young men over a horse that had been bred to the wrong mare, a scouting report from the north that needed thinking through, the matter of a trader named Goss who had been selling watered whiskey to any young man with 3 hides, which I was going to put a stop to with or without his cooperation. I was busy. I am always busy. That is the job. But I heard she was helping Winona, carrying water, scraping hides, not because she was told to, Winona told me, but because she watched how things were done and then did them. Winona said she was a quick learner. From Winona, that was a significant thing to say. I went to Winona's lodge on the 4th evening and asked how Clara was. Winona said she ate well and slept like a stone and did not weep. I said, good. Winona said, she asked about you. I said, what did she ask? Winona said, she asked whether you were married. I did not say anything to that for a moment. Then I said, what did you tell her? Winona said, I told her you were married once and that your wife died of the fever 4 winters ago and that you haven't looked at a woman since, which everyone knows and which you apparently thought was a secret. I went back to my lodge. My wife's name had been Walks Quietly, Inilla Manny, and she was the kind of woman who made stillness feel like a presence rather than an absence. We were married 11 years. We had one son who died in his 3rd winter of a sickness that came through and took 7 of our children in 2 weeks, and after that there was no more. I do not talk about her much. I think about her still, particularly in the mornings and particularly in November when the cold comes in from the north, and the light gets low and slant, and the smoke from the cook fires goes straight up because there is no wind. She loved that November light. I cannot fully explain why I haven't been able to stop seeing it through her eyes. I was not looking for anything when Clara Aldrich came into my camp. I want to say that plainly because a man should be honest about these things. I was not setting out to find anyone. What I did because a wrong had been done, and it sat badly on me, and I am not built to leave a wrong sitting. That is a true thing. But there is another true thing alongside it, which is that when she stepped up onto my horse and I mounted behind her, and I felt the warmth of her through the morning cold, something woke up in me that I had decided was finished. And I did not know what to do with that, so I put it somewhere and did my job. 12 days after I brought her, a man came from the east. Not Aldrich, Aldrich knew better. This was a man named Coulter, Frank Coulter, who ran cattle from a spread near the fork, and who had some arrangement with the fort, and with the Territorial Land Office, and who had been working for 2 years to get this particular stretch of river valley mapped and assigned, and eventually cleared. He came with 2 other men, and a piece of paper, and the kind of smile that is actually an argument. He came to me in the open ground between the lodges and the cottonwoods, which is where I receive such visitors, and he told me that there was a woman in my camp who was there against her will, that her father was seeking her return, that the army was interested in whatever I had done. He said a few more things after that. I waited until he was done. I said, the woman came of her own choice. She is free to leave of her own choice. I will not stop her and I will not compel her. Go ask her. He said he wasn't in the habit of taking directions from me on my own property, which made no sense, but men like Coulter often make no sense when they are reaching for a thing they want and running out of reach. I said, then leave. His 2 men put their hands near their rifles, not on them, near them, which is the language men use when they want to threaten without committing. I looked at those 2 men the way I look at the Elk River in August, when it is low and quiet and anybody who knows it goes deep in places. Neither of them moved. Clara had come out of Winona's lodge. She had been watching from near the cottonwoods. She walked across the open ground, not fast, not slow, and she came and stood beside me, not behind me, beside me. She said to Coulter, I am here by my own choice. My father sold me like a heifer, and this man brought me here because there was nowhere else to go that was decent. You go back and tell my father that I'll return when he gives me a reason to, which will be never, and if the army wants to come and talk to me, they are welcome to come and talk to me. Coulter looked at her. He looked at me. He looked at the 2 men who had their hands near their rifles and then back at me, and I think in that moment he did the accounting that men like Coulter always eventually do, which is the accounting between what they want and what it will cost. He left. I did not look at Clara right away. I was watching Coulter and his men ride east. When I was satisfied they were going and not circling, I turned, and she was still there, standing beside me with her arms crossed against the morning cold, watching the same direction. She said, he'll be back. I said, yes. She said, will you handle it? I said, yes. She looked at me then, straight on the way she had in the barn the first day. She said, you don't say much, do you? I said, I say what needs saying. She almost smiled. Almost. She turned and went back toward Winona's lodge, and I stood there in the open ground thinking about the Coulter problem, and also, if I am being straight about it, about the way she had come and stood beside me without being asked. Coulter came back 3 times over the next 6 weeks. The second time, he brought a man from the land office with more papers. The third time, he brought a deputy from the territorial sheriff's office out of Laramie. The second time, I brought my own paper, a letter from the agency man at Fort Laramie, a man named Pratt who I had dealt with honestly for 12 years and who dealt honestly with me in return, which was a rarer thing than it should have been. The letter said essentially that I was a chief of good standing and that any disputes involving persons at my camp were to be addressed through the agency. Coulter did not like that letter. He did not like that I had it. The third time, the deputy from Laramie was a young man named Hicks who had enough sense to ask questions before making statements, which put him ahead of most. I told him what had happened with the Aldrich matter. I told him Clara was there freely. I offered to let him speak with her alone, which he did. He came back from that conversation looking like a man who has just learned that the problem he came to solve is not the problem that actually exists. He was polite when he left. He shook my hand. Coulter's fourth visit. He came alone, and he came in the evening, and he didn't come as far as the cottonwoods. He stopped at the top of the rise, and I rode out to meet him. He said, "This isn't finished." I said, "It isn't finished because you keep coming back. That is your choice." He said, "I'll get what I came for one way or another." I said, "Let me tell you something about this valley. I have lived in it since before you knew it existed. I know every water source and every ridge and every approach. I have 30 men who have been riding these plains since they were boys. I have been patient with you because patience is the right tool for a man like you. But patience has a bottom, Mr. Coulter, and you are getting close to it." He sat his horse for a long time for a man who came out here thinking he had the upper hand. Finally he said, "You'd fight for a white woman." I said, "I'd fight for anyone in my camp who had been wronged. She is in my camp. She was wronged. That is the whole of it." He rode away. He did not come back. I want to be honest. I don't know entirely what kept him away after that. Maybe it was the letter from Pratt. Maybe it was the deputy from Laramie who was sharper than Coulter expected. Maybe it was the 30 men I mentioned. Probably all of it together, and probably the particular quality of the silence I maintained when he was talking, which I have been told is unpleasant for men who are accustomed to getting a reaction. What I know is that after the fourth visit the valley was quiet, and in the quiet something changed. She had been with us nearly 2 months when I first had a real conversation with her, not the exchange of necessary information kind, but the kind where you are talking because you want to and not because you have to. It was an evening in late October, cold coming, the sky going that particular bronze color it gets just before dark in that month. I was sitting outside my lodge risoling a moccasin. I do my own sewing, which some men think is beneath a chief, and I think is just sense, since nobody else is going to get the fit right. She walked by and stopped and watched me for a moment. She said, "You do that well." I said, "I've had practice." She sat down on the ground nearby, not asking permission, which I noticed. She had stopped asking permission for things she didn't need permission for, which was a change from the first days when she treated every action like it might be wrong. She said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Why did you come for me, really?" I thought about that. I said, "My mother taught me that there is a difference between something that happens in your sight and something that happens in your knowing. If a thing happens in your knowing, you are part of it, whether you step in or not. I knew what your father did. Once I knew it, I was part of it, so I went." She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "My father used to say that a man's first duty was to himself, and his second was to his bloodline, and everything else was sentiment." I said, "Your father traded you for livestock." She said, "Yes, I know." She pulled her knees up and looked at the sky. She said, "What's the word for it? That principle you said, in your language." I said, "Midakui oyas adjective I ing. We are all related." She said it back to me slowly, wrong in the way that a person is wrong the first time they hold a new tool. She said, "What does that mean exactly?" I said, "It means that every living thing is your relation, your cousin or your brother or your grandmother or your child. So when one of your relations is in trouble, you are in trouble." She was quiet again. The sky was almost dark. The cook fires were going and the smell of them was in the air, that good camp smell of wood and meat, and the particular sweetness of burning sage. She said, "Nobody has ever thought of me as a relation before." I said, "I know." She looked at me then, and I looked at her, and something went between us that neither of us said, which is the only honest way those things travel. She looked back at the sky. I went back to my sewing. November came hard that year. Snow before the month was half done, the kind of snow that comes sideways off the north and gets into everything, your collar and your cuffs and the gap between a door and its frame, no matter how well you fitted it. The river iced at the edges. The horses stood in the wind with their tails to it and their heads down, which is what horses know to do and what people ought to do more of. She was helping Winona prepare for the cold, extra hides on the walls of the lodge, laying up food, the things women know how to do in this country that keep people alive. Winona told me in a private moment that Clara worked harder than most people she had known, and that she had a gift for knowing what needed doing before she was told, which Winona considered the most important quality in any person. High praise from Winona is a quiet thing, but it is real. I found myself watching for her. I don't mean in a particular way, not at first, just the ordinary awareness of a person who has become part of the shape of your camp, so that when they are absent there is a small wrongness to the air. I noticed when she laughed at something one of the children said. I noticed the way she moved through the camp, not carefully, the way she had at first, but with ease, the way a person moves when they have decided a place belongs to them or they to it. I noticed these things, and I also noticed that I was noticing them, which was its own kind of information. One night in the third week of November I could not sleep. This is not uncommon for me. I lay in my lodge listening to the wind work at the seams, and thinking about the various things that require thinking about. A band of Crow men who had been reported near the northern grazing grounds. A young man of my own people named Stands Alone who had been drinking, and who I was going to have to talk to before it became something worse. A letter I needed to send through Pratt regarding a boundary question at the agency. The ordinary freight of a chief's night. After a while I got up and went outside. The snow had stopped. The cold was absolute, the kind that hits your face like a hand and takes your breath for a second, but the sky had cleared, and the stars were out in that particular winter density, thick and close, and the Milky Way a road across the middle of everything. I stood and looked at it. She was there, standing maybe 20 feet away, her blanket wrapped tight, looking at the same sky. She said, without looking at me, "I couldn't sleep either." I said, "The wind woke you." She said, "No, it wasn't the wind." I didn't ask what it was. Sometimes a question is less than silence. After a while she said, "I've been thinking about staying." I let that sit. She said, "I don't have anywhere particular to go. I thought I might someday go east to my mother's family in Ohio, people I've never met. But I don't know them, and they don't know me, and I'm not sure we would be able to begin. And I've been here nearly 3 months now, and I know these people, and I know this camp, and I know." She stopped. I said, "What?" She turned and looked at me. Her face in the starlight, the cold on her cheeks, her breath a small cloud between us. She said, "I know you." I said, "Yes." She said, "Is it possible for me to stay?" I said, "You can always stay. The question is how." She said, "What are the options?" I said, "You can be a guest, which means you have a place here but you are not of here. Or you can be of here, which means different things depending on what kind of you mean." She looked at me for a long time. I looked back. The cold was considerable and neither of us was moving. She said, "What kind of do you want to mean?" That was a harder question than any Coulter had asked me. I said, "I have been a widower for 4 years. I have not intended to be otherwise. I did not go east to get you. I went because a wrong was done and I could not leave it. But somewhere between then and now." I stopped. She waited. I am not comfortable with the particular kind of sentence that requires you to put a feeling into words, because feelings in words are nearly always less than the feeling, and I do not like saying a lesser version of a true thing. I said, somewhere between then and now, I stopped being indifferent to whether you stayed. She breathed out slowly. Then she walked toward me and stopped when she was close enough that I could see the particular dark of her eyes in the starlight, and she put her hand flat against my chest, not a grip, just a hand, the warmth of it coming through the cold, and she looked up at me with an expression that I can only describe as clear. Like someone who has been trying to read a page in bad light and has finally moved near enough to a fire. She said, "Then I'll stay." I put my hand over hers. Just that. Just my hand over hers in the cold, with the stars overhead and the camp quiet and the wind somewhere north of us, gone for now. We were married in the spring, when the grass was coming back and the Elk River was high and green from snowmelt. It was not a grand ceremony. Among my people, a marriage is between two people and their families and their community, and the ceremony reflects that. It is participatory rather than performed, which I have always preferred. Winona officiated, which surprised no one. Clara wore a dress that Winona and two other women had made her from soft doeskin, worked fine with quillwork in the colors she had chosen herself. She chose yellow and white, which Winona said meant she had good instincts about such things, and Winona is rarely wrong. I remember the particular quality of that morning, the air still cool from the night, the new grass wet from dew, the light coming in from the east low and sidelong and making everything gold-edged. I remember standing beside her and feeling, for the first time in a long time, that I was standing somewhere I was supposed to be. Not because I had arrived somewhere, but because I had stopped being in motion toward or away from something. Just standing in one place with a good woman beside me and a clear day in front of us. She looked at me during the ceremony and I looked at her, and I saw what I had been seeing more and more of those last months, which was a woman who was not performing ease but who had actually arrived at it. She was not the woman from the barn, she carried no ropes, she had not looked afraid in months, she moved through the camp with the authority of someone who knows where she belongs. But she was also not entirely the woman from the barn, because that woman had no one. She had had no one for a long time, and you could see it in the way she held herself alone. That quality was gone. I do not think I put it there exactly. I think she put it there herself and I just made room. Which, if I understand the thing correctly, is what a good marriage is. The first summer, we had trouble of the ordinary kind, bad winter for the elk. 3 horses taken by Crow raiders that I recovered at some effort. A dispute between my band and a neighboring band over the rights to a particular fishing stretch that took 2 councils and an amount of patience I did not entirely have. Clara involved herself in none of the political things, which she understood was right, and in everything else, which she understood was necessary. She was useful in ways I had not anticipated. She spoke a kind of border Spanish from her time in Missouri that turned out to matter twice, once with a Mexican horse trader who came through, and once, more significantly, with a woman who arrived in the camp in bad circumstances from the South and who needed someone who could hear her. That second thing was important. Clara sat with that woman for 4 days. She came to me on the 3rd day and asked what resources I could put toward her situation. I told her what I could do and she told me what she needed and we worked it out. And when it was done, when the woman had a safe place and passage east to people who could help her further, Clara came to find me at the end of that day, and she was tired in that particular way that comes from doing a hard right thing, and she stood beside me and put her head against my shoulder and did not say anything for a long time. I put my arm around her. After a while she said, "I've been thinking about what you said, that principle." I said, "Midikuyo yas adjective I eng." She said, "Yes, I think I understand it now. I think I understand it differently than when you explained it." I said, "How do you understand it now?" She said, "I understand it in my stomach, not in my head." I said, "That's the right place to understand it." My second winter with Clara, the Coulter business came back, not Coulter himself, but the land question that he had been the face of. A surveying party from the territorial government came through in September, before the first snow, with their instruments and their stakes and their self-assurance. I met them at the boundary of our ground and I talked to them at length, and I sent a letter through Pratt, and I involved a lawyer in Cheyenne that the agency used, a man named Rhodes who was precise and careful and expensive, and I paid him what he was worth. Clara wrote some of the letters. This surprised me. Her education was better than I had understood, and she had a particular quality on paper that I lack, which is the ability to sound firm without sounding combative, which is apparently what certain people in certain offices need to hear before they will act reasonably. She did not ask whether she should help. She just sat down with paper and quill and said, "Tell me what you need to say and I'll find the way to say it." We kept our ground. I want to be clear about that. We kept it not because of the letters, not because of the lawyer, not because of any one thing. We kept it because I have never ceded an inch of it, and because the people who wanted it eventually decided the cost of taking it was too high. That is the whole truth of how land is held. But the letters helped, and knowing that she was beside me in that work, that she had made herself part of it without being asked, without being thanked, without making anything about her own stake in the outcome, that meant something I have not found a clean word for. My third winter with her, she told me she was carrying a child. She told me at the same hour, near enough, that I had first seen her in Winona's camp, that low November light, the smoke going straight up, the cold on the edges of everything. She came to the door of my lodge and she told me plainly, the way she does things, without preamble or management, and then she stood there watching my face. I don't know exactly what she expected. I know what she got, which was that I sat down. I sat down heavily on the bench by the fire and I put my hands on my knees and I sat there. And after a moment I was aware that my eyes were wet, which I had not expected, and which I was not going to pretend wasn't happening. She came and sat beside me. She didn't say anything. She put her hand on my arm just below the shoulder and she sat with me. After a while I said, "I lost a son." She said, "I know." I said, "He was 3 winters." She said, "I know." I said, I decided after that I was not going to want another child, that it was a thing I could decide and the deciding would be enough. She said, "And now?" I said, "And now I can't remember making that decision." She made a sound then, not a laugh, softer than a laugh, and she leaned her head against my shoulder, that same way she had after the long days with the woman from the south, and I sat there with my hand over hers and the fire going and the cold outside, and I thought about walks quietly, and about the son I had lost, and about whether a man has the right to ask for a third turn at a thing he has already lost twice, whether that is hope or just stubbornness. I decided it didn't matter which it was. I decided the feeling was the feeling, and the child was the child, and I had been given something I had closed my hands against, and I was going to open my hands. She gave birth in the summer, late summer, when the heat was flat and still, and the river ran low and clear. A boy. He was born early in the morning before the light, and I was outside the lodge, because that is where the father goes, which is one of the traditions I have never quarreled with, because the alternative is standing inside feeling useless. And I heard him cry, and the sound of it hit me somewhere below the ribs and didn't let go for a long time. Winona brought him out to me before dawn had fully come. She put him in my arms without ceremony. Winona never performs anything, and she looked at me over his head and she said in our language, "He is strong." I looked at my son. He was red and furious, and he smelled like the particular smell of new life that I had forgotten. And I stood there in the pre-dawn with the camp beginning to wake around me and the river in the distance and the first birds making their first remarks about the morning. And I held him, and I will not try to say what that felt like because I have already established that words are not equal to everything. I went inside after a while and I sat beside Clara, who was worn clear through with the honest exhaustion of the thing she had just done. She looked at the boy in my arms, and then she looked at my face. She said, "You've been crying." I said, "Yes." She said, "Is that out of character for you?" I said, "Considerably." She smiled. A real one, slow and unguarded, the one I had been seeing more and more of, and which I do not take for granted because I know how long she went without having much occasion for it. She reached out and touched the boy's hand with one finger, and he gripped it, that immediate fierce grip of a newborn who has not yet learned that not everything is something to hold on to. She said, "What will you call him?" I thought about it. I said, "Chante Chihila, the one the heart holds dear." It was my mother's name for me. She tried to say it. She was better at it than she'd been with Mitakui Oyas adjective ing. Almost right. She said, "Can he have a short name, for the English side of him?" I said, "What would you want?" She thought a moment. She said, "James, my grandfather." I said, "James." She said, "James Chante Chihila." I said, "That will give the agency man trouble." She said, "Good." He is 5 now. He runs like he is trying to outrace the wind and has not yet learned that the wind always wins eventually. He speaks both languages without knowing he is doing anything notable, which children do, because children have not yet been told what is supposed to be difficult. He has his mother's eyes, that particular dark that I have looked at across a fire for 5 years now and have not gotten used to. I am 52. My hair is going gray at the temples, and I am stiffer in the cold mornings than I used to be, and there is a particular hill to the south that I used to run for the pleasure of it and now I walk, which is a change I have made my peace with. The job is what it always was. The old men trust my judgment. The young men watch my hands. I eat last and sleep lightest, and there is always something requiring attention. But in the evenings, when the work is done and the camp settles and the fire is low, Clara is there. She is always there. She is there the way solid ground is there. You don't think about it exactly because you don't have to, and you only realize what it means when you remember the years you spent on uncertain footing. She said something to me last winter, one of those winter nights when the cold is total and the lodge holds everything warm and the boy is asleep and we are talking, the way we have learned to talk, which is without hurry and without performance. She said, "I want you to know something." I said, "Tell me." She said, "Before you came into that barn, I had been sitting there trying to figure out what I had done wrong. Not what my father had done. I knew what my father had done. I was trying to figure out what I had done, what failure of mine had led to being worth 2 cows. I had been sitting with that for 3 hours. I looked at her. I said, "And now?" She put her hand flat against my chest, the way she had done that first winter night under the stars. She said, "Now I know the answer. I know what I was worth. I was worth a man riding 2 miles with a rope on a brindle and a gray to return something that shouldn't have been traded." I put my hand over hers. She said, "You didn't ask for anything. You didn't make a bargain. You just came and brought me here." I said, "A wrong was done." She said, "I know. But the thing is, you could have just returned the cows and left. You didn't have to bring me anywhere. And you didn't ask anything of me, and you didn't expect anything. And I spent the first weeks here waiting for the expectation, and it never came. And that was the thing that was when I knew what kind of man you were." I didn't say anything to that. I sat with it. She said, "You've been patient with me since the first day, more patient than I deserved." I said, "You deserved it." She said, "I'm telling you that you gave me something nobody had ever given me. You gave me the chance to choose freely. You made it so I could choose freely by making it safe to do so. And I chose you, and I would choose you again, starting from that barn, starting from whatever starting place you name." I held her hand against my chest. The fire was low. Outside, the wind was doing what the wind does. The boy was asleep. I said, "I know." She said, "I wanted to say it out loud." I said, I'm glad you did. The 2 cows are still on the property. The brindle died a few winters back, old age. She just lay down in the snow one morning and didn't get up, which is a better death than most. The gray one with the torn ear is still going. 13 years old now, which is too old for a range cow, but she has become, somehow, the matriarch of the herd, and the younger cows defer to her, and she takes this as her due. She gave us calves for 11 of those 13 years. She has earned her place. My wife named her when I wasn't paying attention. I asked about it once, asked what she had called the gray cow, and Clara said, without looking up from what she was doing, Worth. I said, what? She said, her name is Worth. I thought about that. Then I went back to what I was doing, which I don't remember now, and I did not say anything more about it. Some things name themselves right the first time.